Right. Chapter 2, the political events that shaped the lives of the inhabitants of Rumah Batu from 1941 to 1963. So we are now going to look into the house itself from this time, from 1941 to 1963. And we're going to look at the events that shaped the lives of the inhabitants. Now, we have to remember that the people living in the house and those who experience the events at first hand are two different people. Some people living in the house had direct effect on the events, like my grandfather, Abang Haji Zawawi, participated in the anti-cession movement. Some of them were just too young to remember what happened. So we have to take into consideration memory. We have to take into consideration memory as a form of historical, as a form of the history, as a form of sources. Memory is weak when the memory is not accurate, okay? So number one is I'm asking people who are already ahead in years about something that happened when they were very small. So either the memory is strong or sometimes the memory may not be congruent with the events at hand. One example is Datin Dayan Hajalela and Janglelo told me events that happened a certain year when actually it happened in another year. So that does not corroborate with history. So we have to corroborate it with the historical facts. Memory is weak when it depends on human consciousness, which is also weak, okay? A memory is strong when it corroborates with the facts at hand. So we always have to come back to the facts. So in that sense, we have another chapter that talks about personal memory and social experience, because most of the people living in Rumah Batu will definitely talk about their experience living in the house, not necessarily their experience of the house as a historical building. So we have to know the differences here. Now, I'm going to start reading. The reason why I will begin the political events with 1941, the birth year of my father, is because from now on, the lens through which we will view the lived experience of this house will primarily come from those who were members of Nek Jawa's, Abang Haji Zawawi's family. He married Dayan Sama'ah, the eldest daughter of Abang Haji Fadil, okay? And when my father was born, she passed away 40 days later. That's why he remarried the younger daughter, all right? And he is the only man to have given children to Abang Haji Fadil. So Abang Haji Fadil's great-grandchildren all come from Abang Haji Zawawi in terms of the line of the female. Okay, in terms of line of the male, of course, you have Abang Sani and Abang Bisuni, Abang Haji Jadal, all have children of their own, and Abang Samad. But among the female, Dayang Salha was unmarried, Motleh. Datin Dayang Aisyah, Nek Ya adopted, and Nek Ros and Nek Sam both married Abang Haji Zawawi. So from the female, he's the only one who have produced children and thus grandchildren. So, and in Malay culture, that's very important because the line of when people get married, they tend to stay in the house of the married person, of the wife's side. So unlike Chinese, when the woman gets married, she moves into her husband's family. In old Malay culture, possibly coming back from Adat Papate or Malay culture from Minangkabau, it's possible that the reason why that is because of the Adat Papate, which propagates matriarchy of some sort. Now, let's come back to this. I'm going offhand here. The reason for tightening the scope of my oral history subjects is because Rumah Batu was predominantly their home. For most parts, and this has something to do with marriage, yeah? This has something to do with marriage. For most parts of this period, 1941 to 1963. So it just so happens these years and that family, it matches, okay? Other families came and went over this period, but my grandfather's, Nek Jawa's own household, coincidentally possibly, formed the core household who remained during this period of history. And we're exploring this period, not because of them, though they are the lens to which I view this time, but because it was a time of remarkable change. So you might ask me, why don't you interview the children of all the other warisas? Well, the other warisas were not staying in the house at the time. You know, it was this family in particular, from what I know, that was staying in the time. And sometimes we have to do history from the lens of the historian. In 1937, Datuk Syahbandar Abang Haji Abdillah became the reinstated Datuk Petinggi. It was the first time the title was used since the scandal of Datuk Petinggi Abu Ghaffur in the 1850s. 7 years prior, in 1930, Abang Abdillah moved out from Rumah Batu because he had built a house of his own, Darul Kunia, which is currently used as Chunghwa Middle School number 4. With this departure as the main figure in Rumah Batu, the principal occupant of the house went to his other siblings. Most noticeable among them was Abang Haji Fadil, okay, the third son of the late Datuk Bandar Abang Haji Muhammad Qasim, and younger brother to Datuk Petinggi Abang Haji Abdillah. This chapter is about the lives of those who descended from Abang Haji Fadil, 1860s, 1930s. I'm not so sure on the facts here. For other warisas who know his lifespan, you may provide further information, yes? And what Rumah Batu was like for the years ahead. From this chapter on, the interviews which make up oral histories of Rumah Batu will come into play. Abang Haji Fadil had 8 children, 4 boys and 4 girls. His eldest daughter, Dayang Sama'ah, married my grandfather, Abang Haji Zawawi. Okay, this is taken more of the relationships within the family of Rumah Batu. There is a family tree in Appendix 1 at the back of this book. Yes, so, yeah, okay. With this marriage, sometime in the mid-1920s, my grandfather became one of the main figures of Rumah Batu. This is due to the fact that in Malay culture, I expressed this earlier on, the groom moves into the house and family of his wife. Hence, having daughters is a good thing because it encourages the attainment of more sons through marriage. I had a conversation about this when we was learning about Asian history at the National University of Singapore. And a lot of my Singaporean friends said, you know what about Asian culture? The girl has no choice. They always have to go to the boy's family. And then I realized, here's a counter argument, not for the Malays. The Malays, it's the other way around. The boy goes into the wife's household. And my Chinese friends from Singapore could not understand why that is. Well, they're stuck in their own milieu, I suppose. So as Nek Fadil's, Abang Haji Fadil's own boys were married off into other households, my grandfather became his new son. Okay. It was hoped that as Nek Fadil's other daughters, and he had 3 more daughters, okay? Dayang Hajah Rosdiah, starting with the eldest was Dayang Sama'ah, my grandmother, Dayang Salha, Motlek, Dayang Hajah Rosdiah, Nek Haji Ros, who married my grandfather after my grandmother's passing, and Dayang Aisyah, Datin Dayang Aisyah, Nek Ya, okay? And she married my grandfather's eldest brother, Abang Haji Moni. So, as Nek Fadil's own boys were being married off into other households, like Abang Sani and Abang Haji Jadal, and also Abang Bisuni, Inspector Bisuni, and Abang Samad possibly as well. My grandfather became his new son. It was hoped that as Nek Fadil's other daughters were being married off, the man would attain more sons. However, by the time of Nek Fadil's death, my grandfather remained as the sole son-in-law. Now, here is where we come into the oral histories. Nek Jawa is the only male married to Abang Fadil's family. We could assume that Rumah Batu was Nek Fadil's house after the death of Abang Muhammad Qasim Datuk Bandar. His Nek Fadil's wife is my grandmother, Nek Yok, who died in 1951. She was an important person in that house, being the eldest there. He, my father, lived so well that people really thought Rumah Batu was his house. Even today, they still call Rumah Batu Rumah Guru Jawa, the house of teacher Jawa or Abang Haji Zawawi, seeing that he was the principal occupant of the house or the most well-known among its inhabitants. Throughout his stay, it was recognized as his house. When my father's older brother married my auntie, one of Nek Fadil's daughters, later, my uncle already had a house of his own. They did not want to get married in a traditional way as he was a widower and my aunt was his second wife. It was a quick and easy wedding, hence with that marriage, my father still maintained his status as chief occupant of Rumah Batu during his stay from the 20s to the 60s. I'm not so sure when Abang Haji Zawawi got married to Dayang Sama'ah. If you have information about that, it would be much appreciated. This allowed my grandfather's family to take over the spaces of the house. And as years passed, my grandmother's original family, the family of Abang Haji Fadil, slowly dwindled. Possibly, I would like to say here that possibly it's not that they dwindled, but more of those who were further up one more generation, Abang Haji Fadil's families of the other warises were not there. But please correct me if I'm wrong, yeah? By the time my father was born, the main family that stayed in Rumah Batu was in fact my grandparents and the children, in addition to some aunts and uncles who had not as yet been married off, as well as my father's grandmother, Dang Mahnet Yok, the widow of Nek Fadil, Abang Haji Fadil. This goes to show that ownership of Rumah Batu may have harked back to its original founders, but as the newer generations used the house as a home, ownership changed hands. This generation occupied the house and took care of it while they were in residence there. If they lived good lives as my grandfather did, people would come to believe the house to be his. It's for this reason that during this period, the house was known more as Rumah Guru Jawa than Rumah Batu. So it's just a coincidence that they were the main ones who were staying there at the time. Coming back to the events at hand, this period, 1941 to 1963, was a period of great change for Sarawakian history. The century-long reign of the Bruk Raj came to an end in 1946, and with it the end of a Parabangan supremacy in Sarawakian political affairs. This is because Sarawak was ceded to the British Crown, to the British as a crown colony in that year. The need for cession was because the Second World War, which brought the Japanese invasion of Sarawak, destroyed the country to such an extent that only by being a colony would it be able to recover from the ravages of wartime. Okay, this is taken from Bujang bin Muhammad Noor, The Cession of Sarawak to Great Britain, 1946, Singapore University of Malaya, 1959. Page 20, the Japanese invasion and occupation was a catastrophe. Despite the fact that Sarawak suffered less damage, all traces of its former prosperity disappeared and its inhabitants were reduced to poverty and misery. And that, by the way, is my Anjang Bujang, who married to Datin Dayang Hajalela, Anjang Lelo, the late Datin Dayang Hajalela, who has recently passed away. So Al-Fatiha to her, yeah, to her memory. She's also one of the oral history participants of this document. The period of Japanese occupation, 1941 to 1945, is thus covered in this chapter. Thereafter, in 1946, the British faced some local resistance against cession. This was seen as a time of conflict within and beyond the Parabangan family because it was about who would support cession towards the British Crown and who would support the continuation of the Bruk Raj. This too will be covered within this chapter, as the family was torn apart socially, emotionally, and also economically over the question of Sarawak's future. Okay, let's carry on. When the British finally stabilized Sarawak throughout the 1950s, they managed to modernize the state. This period will have social repercussions for the family who lived in Rumah Guru Jawa or Rumah Batu. We will also look into what took place for the families living in Rumah Batu or Rumah Guru Jawa during this period of stability and how the building was used for various civic purposes. Eventually, by 1963, it was ripe for independence when a federation with Malaya, Singapore, and North Borneo was proposed as the Federation of Malaysia. All these political shifts may not have meant much for those who stayed in Rumah Batu, but the objective of this chapter is to unveil the lived experience of those who call this house their home for this particular period of time. We will view these political events from the perspectives of my interviewees or oral history subjects. The interviewees lived throughout this period of change and hence have a close connection with the events that took place herein. The house will still remain important during this period as it was used for all sorts of purposes, fulfilling the desires of whoever came into power, be it as a rubber storage facility for the Japanese or a maternity day clinic for the British. So we'll go into both the historical facts of the three periods covered, as well as the oral testimonies of those who were interviewed. The three periods covered in sum are as follows: the Japanese occupation of Sarawak, 1941 to 1945, the anti-cession movement of 1946 to 1949, and the British colonial period spanning the 1950s to 1963, after which Malaysia was formed as an independent nation. We might just be covering the Japanese occupation for today, 1941 to 1945. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, it did not just startle the USA, but in fact sent shockwaves around the world. Under a fortnight, the Japanese had invaded Sarawak through the surrender of Miri Town, and thereafter the capitulation of Kuching on Christmas Eve. Okay. Haji Muhammad Hasbi Sulaiman Perjuangan Anti-Cession Sarawak, Peranan Utama PKMS, Kuching PKMS, 1989, page 37. This event heralded the beginning of what many believe to be a dark period in Sarawak's history. The country was ruled by terror and misery in spite of the fact that the Japanese were supposed to be Asia's liberators from white colonialism. This occupation lasted from January 1942 to August 1945, when the Australian Army liberated Sarawak not long after the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan by the American Army, Enola Gay. Yeah? When news was received in Sarawak that the Japanese were going to attack Sarawak, the Raja Sir Charles Viner was already in Australia. He wanted to continue the administration of Sarawak from Australia, but instead appointed his brother, the Tuan Muda Bertram Brooke, to set up a commission to take care of Sarawak's governmental affairs from London. This is taken from Bujang bin Muhammad Noor, page 17. This left the people of Sarawak to look after their own affairs under Japanese rule. The Japanese had cordial relations with the natives of Sarawak. Some of the natives even took up posts in the civil service. The future Malaysian governor and father to the present chief minister, Tun Abang Haji Openg, was one of them. Okay. Tun is the highest title awarded by the King of Malaysia. He was given this title in tandem with his post as governor of Sarawak and Malaysia, and he was our first governor, yeah? All right, and this is taken, okay, this is taken from Bob Rees, Masa Japun, Sarawak under the Japanese, 41 to 45, Sarawak Literary Society, 1998. Right. He started his career in the Sarawak civil service during the Japanese occupation. However, the Japanese had antagonistic relationships with two particular ethnic groups, namely the Chinese and the Europeans. The Chinese were treated badly because they were involved in freeing Japan's largest colony at the time, Manchukuo, Manchuria and parts of China, from the grips of this Asian aggressor. The Europeans symbolized the old order of Western imperialism, which Japan vowed to liberate Asians from. Hence, their aggression towards Europeans derived from the fact that their presence was a natural menace to all Asians alike. As my aunt Datin Dayang Hajah Lela Anjang Lelo said, okay, so let's continue here. Whenever the Japs came to the house, so by the way, I am translating it from Bahasa Sarawak. The interview was answered in Bahasa Melayu Sarawak, and I had to do the translations. So, only my dad spoke in English, and the other interviewees, except Mak May, Dayang Hajah Maimuna, my auntie, she spoke in English as well. But the other interviewees like Anjang Lelo, Nahlena, and Abang Boy, they spoke in Bahasa Melayu Sarawak, in which I had to do the translations into English, right? Whenever the Japs came to the house, I had to entertain them by singing to them. I was afraid of them because they wore striking green uniforms with aggressive looking hats, though the younger Japanese soldiers were the ones who were to be more feared, for they were carefree and as a result confiscated our goods and demanded our immediate respect without the slightest hesitation to retaliate in brute force should we fail to comply. Okay, taken from Anjang Lelo. Yeah? Life was uncertain and dangerous during the Japanese occupation. There was no certainty that one would be alive from one minute to the next. This was due to living in Kuching during wartime. The irony of the fear was that being a Japanese colony, Kuching was under attack by the very forces that used to protect it, the British. Datin Dayang Hajalela says, recaptured this fear as follows. We went into an underground room to shelter from the bombing. Whenever there was an aircraft flying over the house, we would go underground for cover. When the plane was gone, then we would come out. Okay, taken from the same source, Ibid. Many moved to other places to seek distance from the brutality and violence, as well as the misery, which plagued Kuching during this period of occupation and war. The family of Abang Haji Zawawi was one of the many families who left their homes in Kuching to distance themselves from the invaders. As Abang Zulkifli, my father's cousin, said, we moved to Samara because we were afraid of the Japanese. Most people moved to far-off villages because they feared the Japanese. So we were no less different from those who sought safety at a time of turmoil. Okay. This is taken from Abang Zulkifli bin Abang Bisuni, interview 28 June 2008. So I visited Samara just before the lockdown, and and it was quite interesting to see the place where my father's family moved to. My father learned from his older siblings as well as from his own father that he was barely a year old when his family had to move to Samara. It was a sad story because prior to that, my grandmother had passed away due to postnatal complications 40 days after my father's birth. Yet barely 40 days after the funeral, my grandfather married his late wife's caretaker and younger sister, Rostia, Neaji Ros, because my father needed a mother. Summed up from all the interviews. They left house Samara not long after the marriage took place. Once my paternal family had left Rumah Batu, the Japanese soldiers used the house. Dayang Hajalena and Datin Dayang Hajalela both recall that after the family returned from their exile in Samara, they saw the house filled with stacks of rubber sheets. Rubber was important for the industrial growth of the colonizing forces, and the Japanese as well as the British used the rubber planted in Sarawak and other parts of Malaya and North Borneo to fuel their own economies. Okay. Dayang Hajalena pointed out that the stacks went so far up as to reach the ceiling of the ground floor. Okay. Dayang Hajalena binti Abang Haji Zawawi, interview 28 June 2008, and Datin Dayang Hajalela binti Abang Haji Zawawi. This proves, and I believe I interviewed Anjang Lelo in January 2009, yeah? This proves the fact that the Japanese used this house as a storage facility. My father recollected that one of his first memories were the many license plates all over the house. These he used to play with, to build model houses with his relatives and friends. Quite similar. This is my father, Abang Ahmad Kasim bin Abang Haji Zawawi. As a little child, I used to get blocks of wood and build those houses as well, just play things, yeah. Like to use normal things, not necessarily toys to play with. Needless to say, the Japanese liked to use the house for many things that were unknown to the family due to their absence. My father suspected that the Japanese could have used strips of wood from Rumah Batu's ground floor, hence tamper with the house's building materials. Yet Datin Dayang Hajalela remembered that the Japanese did no such thing. She recollected that the house did not change much during this period. The Japanese did not destroy anything in the house, seeing that its condition was more or less the same when we headed to Samara with when we returned. Datin Dayang Hajalela binti Abang Haji Zawawi. So this contention in memory can be a problem for historical writing, yeah? Though she added that the Japanese did use Rumah Batu for many other things when the family was in exile. She said that they used the house as an office, clinic, and court. All right, it is probable that the Japanese did so because there were not many buildings available in Kuching at this time big enough to play these roles. Hence, the Japanese found Rumah Batu to be useful and took advantage of the family's absence to utilize its spaces. It's possible at this time that Rumah Batu and Mill Hill Block at St. Joseph's School were possibly some of the very few big buildings in Kuching, yeah? This era came to a close on August 1945. Sarawak was left in shambles. The Raja Sir Charles Vinabrook had made arrangements with the British Colonial Office to help Sarawak recover. In spite of his good intentions, this recovery plan was rejected by the Malay populace. They were led by Datuk Petinggi Abang Haji Abdullah and highly supported by the inhabitants of Rumah Batu and Darul Kunia. Petinggi Abdullah, being the chief native officer of Bruk Sarawak, represented Perabangan resistance to British rule for fear of losing their land and home to the British. I would like to stop here for this week, and I know it's a very short one, because if I go further on, it will be too long. And also let it be information for another time, maybe for next week.